Oh, we are online. So hello everybody. We'll start the second period of our conference. I'd like to remember everybody to fill our attendance sheet, sorry. Again, the link is on the chat. And we will start with a presentation from Professor Emma Otta. Our moderator will be Professor Sylvia Corte from the Universidad de la República in Uruguay. And Professor Sylvia, you have now the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinicius. Good afternoon and welcome again to everyone. Please, those who are here with me in the meeting room, keep your microphones off. And for those watching on YouTube, you can send your questions in the live chat. At the end of Professor's lecture, I'm going to transmit to her your questions, and she will answer as many as possible. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Emma Otta as our first speaker of the afternoon on this first day of the event. Emma is professor at the Experimental Psychology Department from Psychology Institute, Sao Paulo University in Brazil. She's been the head of this department for several years, having trained many professionals and researchers in the area. She is also a restless person from an intellectual point of view, taking interest in many related disciplines. She is an admired and loved professor. Professor Emma is going to talk about nonverbal acoustic communication from a psychoethological perspective. She will focus not only on nonverbal communication, but also on vocal expressions and emotionally modulated speech. Without more to say, now is Emma's turn to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. As Sylvia told you, my talk is on nonverbal acoustic communication from a psychoethological perspective. I would like to begin to homage Professor César Hades. My talk is dedicated to him, who was a passionate and dedicated research mentor who passed away on March 14 of 2012. He started the study of sound communication as part of animal behavior from the perspective of ethology at the Department of Experimental Psychology of the Institute of Psychology of our university. Here you can see two examples of his papers on this matter. One of these, individual differences in infant guinea pig pups isolation whistles, was published together with Patrizia Monticelli, who is organizing this event with me. I would also like to homage Edila Aparecida da Silva. She was a laboratory assistant at the Department of Experimental Psychology that hosts our event. Edila was one of the thousands of people who have died with coronavirus. Dozens of COVID-19 vaccines are in development thanks to the efforts of scientists around the world. We hope that Butantan Institute in São Paulo and Fiocruz in Rio de Janeiro may help scale up manufacturing quickly these vaccines for use in our country. My aim in this lecture is to talk about nonverbal communication, vocal expressions such as sobbing, screaming, and laughing, and emotionally modulated speech indicated by paralinguistic cues. Not only what a person says matters, but also how he or she says it. In my speech, I will focus on the definition of emotion Distinguishing dimensional and categorical approaches to acoustically conveyed emotions, I will present a historical contextualization and talk about interspecific universals in emotional vocalizations. I will present research findings, including a study conducted under my supervision, and present some comments on the state of emotional prosody research. I will start by defining emotion from a functional perspective. I will present you with Franz de Waal's definition. He says, an emotion is a temporary state brought about by biologically relevant external stimuli, whether aversive or attractive. The emotion is marked by specific changes in the organism's body and mind. Which emotion is triggered is often predictable by the situation in which the organism finds itself and can further be inferred from behavioral changes and evoked communicational signals. There exists no one-on-one relation between an emotion and an ensuing behavior, however. Emotions combine with individual experience and cognitive assessment of the situation to prepare the organism for an optimal response. Emotions are triggered by significant life events. In his component process model of emotion, Klaus Scherer distinguishes event evaluation with novelty, predictability, unpredictability, pleasantness, unpleasantness of stimuli, and the coping ability evaluation of the individual. He distinguishes also bodily arousal, such as skin conductance, facial electromyographic reactions, blood pressure, for example. Expressive movements are part of this model. Crying, laughing, smiling, frowning, body posture, gestures. Motivation is part of the component of emotions, with action tendencies, approach reactions, avoidance reactions, and feelings are part of this model, with subjective experiences such as contentment, bitterness. We can distinguish discrete emotions and locate them in a two-dimensional space of valence and activation, positive valence and negative valence, high activation and low activation. The positive emotions are placed in the quadrants K, Q1 and Q2, and the negative emotions are placed in the quadrants Q3 and Q4. The Q3 and Q1 error represents the motivational system of reward acquisition related to reward to increased fitness. And the error Q4 to Q2 represents the motivational system of a punishment avoidance triggered by the perception of danger or threat. In my historical contextualization, I would like to mention the classical work of Charles Darwin, The Expression of Emotions in Men and Animals. He enunciated the principle of antithesis, according to which certain mental states trigger a strong and a voluntary tendency to perform certain movements. The induction of an opposite mental state triggers an equally strong and involuntary tendency to perform antagonistic movements. He gives an example of a dog in threat and appeasement postures. And these postures are the opposite of one and the other. Approximately 100 years after the expression of emotions in men and animals, the subject was revisited by Morton in his article on the occurrence and significance of motivation structural rules in some bird and mammal sounds. And he distinguishes vocalizations used in hostile and friendly contexts. Simply stated, animals use harsh, relatively low-frequency sounds when hostile, and higher frequency, more pure tone-like sounds when frightened, appeasing, or approaching in a friendly manner. Here you can see a representation of these motivational structural rules for vocalization, going from a neutral state at the lower left-hand corner toward intense fear in the upper right-hand corner, intense aggression in the lower right-hand corner, and a blend of fear and aggression in the upper right corner. Thick lines represent noisy vocalizations, and thin lines represent poor tones, and the relative vertical location indicates pitch. Here you can see the facial expressions of a dog with increasing fear and with increasing aggression. You can combine the vocalizations with these facial expressions. I would also like to present you an hypothesis that Darwin proposed for the language evolution, his musical proto-language hypothesis. He says that in human evolution, our ancestors used vocal utterances to express emotions before they had acquired the power to articulate speech. Proto-language was more musical than linguistics, and you focused on sexual selection as the underlying mechanisms of this evolution. Fitch, in his book, The Evolution of Language, summarized and updated Darwin's model. Before vocalizations were used meaningfully, they were used in bonding, courtship, competitive displays. At a later stage, presumably during the evolution of meaningful language, some other selective force kicked in, though that language became equally or better expressed in females and was pushed to develop early, proposes Fitch. Fitch questions the underlying mechanism proposed by Darwin, and he represents the sexual selection with this image and puts a question mark. He considers more probable that mother-infant communication and interaction was an important mechanism in the human evolution of language. Researchers ask, which came earlier, the music or the language? Is language at the base, and is music a subset of linguistic competence, as Pinker thought? Or was there a primeval sonic sub from which languages emerged? Darwin imagined that language emerged from the music-like sounds of the animal kingdom. In his book, The singing Neanderthals, their meeting proposes the idea that music and language have emerged from a form of communication from our early hominids, and which he describes as holistic, manipulative, multimodal, musical, and mimetic. He presents us with his evolutionary theory of language and music. There is evidence for acoustic universals. Humans recognize emotional arousal in vocalizations of other animals. And here you can see the phylogeny of the animal species included in an experiment of Philippe et al. Fundamental mechanisms of vocal emotional expression may be shared among vertebrates and could represent a homologous signaling system. Animals also recognize emotional arousal in human vocalizations. Cross-species perception of emotion from vocal and visual cues has been investigated with dogs under my supervision by Natalia Albuquerque with the co-supervision of Daniel Mills. The stimuli used were dog faces and vocalizations, different vocalizations and faces. Some were happy and playful, others were aggressive or angry. And here you can see also human faces and correspondent vocalizations that were also happy, playful versus angry, aggressive. While the stimuli were projected onto two screens, a single sound was played. The sound could be a dog's bark, a human voice with either positive or negative valence, or a control sound. The dogs looked significantly longer at the conspecific and heterospecific faces whose expression corresponded to the valence of the vocalization, leading to the conclusion that dogs have the mental prototypes for positive versus negative categorization of affect, and that they were able to integrate acoustic and facial emotional information. Natalia found that dogs nose-licked more frequently when observing a negative facial expression. And this happened more frequently when they observed human faces and human voices. It is likely that these negative emotional visual stimuli were perceived as aversive. I conclude my talk with some comments on the state of emotional prosody research. A meta-analysis that was conducted by Bach showed that research focused on English-speaking participants. 79% were English-speaking individuals. 15% were Japanese speakers, and 6% were speakers of other languages, including Portuguese, Spanish, Arabic, Hindi, and Himba. The recognition of basic emotions, for example, joy, sadness, was superior to chance, but there was an own language advantage in comparison to foreign languages. Here you can see some images that were taken from a study that was conducted by a team led by Paul Ekman. They showed that emotional vocal cues communicate affective states across cultural boundaries. And you can see here that group averages for recognition across all emotion categories that they examined. For Himba, the black line, and English, the green line listeners. Here you can see that English sounds were more easily perceived correctly by English listeners, and that Himba sounds were less easily perceived. And correspondingly, for Himba listeners, the English sounds were more difficult to correctly perceive than Himba sounds. In summary, I reviewed evidence of interspecific universals, of cross-cultural recognition of emotions, and of an in-group advantage in the understanding of emotion. A universal acoustic affect program seems to coexist with culturally specific affect programs, as suggested by Elfenbein and Embody in their proposal. I would like to thank Patrícia Monticelli, Vinícius Fraz Davi, Claudio Possani, and Tânia Lucci for their comments and suggestions on an initial version of this talk, which has improved this quality. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Emma. Now we are going to read the questions on chat.
Well, thank you, Emma.
And give
now
them to
we are
you.
Going to read the questions on.
Well, here we have a first question from Patricia Monticelli. What about the sounds of the smiling, laughing, and so on?
This are so interesting manifestations, Patricia, together with crying. I remember that I read a very interesting paper that discussed the development of laughing and crying. And they showed that the babies exhibited laughing in some situations that also triggered crying. But this is a developmental process. Laughing substitutes the crying. And also that the stimuli that trigger laughing became less physical, such as tickling, and more cognitive during the development. From an evolutionary point of view, there is a discussion about the context in which smiling appears and laughing appears. The smiling occurs in more conflictive situations, and laughing in more rough and tumble play situations.
Well, we have another here. It's from me. Regarding Mithen's book, The Singing Neanderthal, it has been questioned whether the famous Neanderthal flute discovered in a cave in Slovenia was actually a musical instrument. Study dismissed the artifact as nothing more than a bone that had been chewed by hyenas. What do you think about Neanderthals' capacities for having such sophisticated ways of communication?
Thank you for your question, Sylvia. There is archaeological evidence for wide musical instruments from the Upper Paleolithic in association with modern human, Homo sapiens. Neanderthals were the closest relatives of modern humans who became extinct around 40,000 years ago. A juvenile bear femur with two complete holes from the Middle Paleolithic was found in a cave in Slovenia in 1995. This piece of bone divides the opinions. For some experts, it is a flute, the oldest musical instrument. For others, it's only a carnivore, chewed bone, a pseudo-artifact. There are studies with computed microtomography showing that a Neanderthal manufacture of an artifact cannot be ruled out. Although the lack of a whole understanding of Neanderthal behavior, using primatological analogy, according to some anthropologists, they would be characterized as intelligent and self-aware individuals. Chimpanzee, for example, they drum on hollow trees. And they also have a preference for music over silence, at least some kind of music. Though we could imagine that the Neanderthals may also have done something like this. And maybe the flute is a flute and not a bone chewed by carnivores.
I agree with you. I also think that that flute is a flute and that Neanderthals have that ability for music. Yes. Thank you. Let's see if there's any other question. Well, another from me then. How and why human languages abilities differ from both our hominid ancestors and from other living hominid species, such as chimpanzees and mountain gorillas?
Thank you again for the question, Sylvia. How language evolved is debated since Darwin. I will make some comments here regarding this complex issue. There are perceptual and cognitive abilities underlying language comprehension and production that are shared with other perceptual and cognitive processes and present in non-human animals. However, there are grammar and syntax components that differentiate human language from animal communication systems. Human language refers to external things in the world, as well as to objects and events distant in place and time by means of arbitrary symbols based on a set of rules for combining these elements. According to Herbert Teres, in his article, Nim Chimpsky and Noam Chomsky, all animals, ourselves included, communicate, but only humans use language as we do.
Thank you. Very clarifying. Now we have a question from Rosana Suemi Tokumaru. She says, thanks for your talk, Professor Emma. Is it possible to separate the role of nonverbal and verbal communication in human communication?
Yes, I think so. Rosana, thank you for your question. The nonverbal communication appears earlier in human development, and it is also present in non-verbal individuals. I saw very interesting papers of children who have an underdeveloped brain system. In other words, they have only no cortex, and they have nonverbal communication. There is a very interesting discussion on this article about our expectation that these individuals will not communicate, but they may communicate, and they may have a very rich communication with smiling, with gaze direction, and so I think that we can separate it, and we can study this non-verbal communication.
Thank you. Rosanna, I hope you are also pleased with the answer. Now we have another question from Patricia Ferreira Monticelli. Have you already studied the acoustic communication in twins?
Patricia, thank you for your question. In fact, we have a great interest in studying it, and this motivated our approximation. Though we recorded the voices of twins individually in our lab before COVID-19. And we have 100 pairs with their voices recorded. And now at your lab, these voices are being decoded, and we are using the Pratt software, and Professor Claudio Possani will speak about this. We are very excited with this possibility of interaction of our laboratories, and today FAPESP approved the grant for Lilian. So we hope that we can have soon results to present. We began studying adult twins, and now we are also studying children. And this is another word. We had the opportunity to hear the talk of Sylvia, and she talked to us about crying. It would be very interesting to study the cries of the twins, and also the development of the vocalizations. Also the non-verbal vocalizations, crying, laughing, and also their language. Professor Frauen is our partner too in this scientific adventure.
Well, thank you again. Now we have, I think that the last question from Professor Gabriel Francescoli. Nonverbal and verbal communication in humans are clearly for me a case of multimodal communication that can be exploited in some situations. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree, Gabo. I think that we can study how they combine, and how we can learn about this. Yes, and we can also examine this multimodal combination, such as Natalia did in her research. Does the dog understand that an angry vocalization goes with angry face? And obviously, when we talk about this with humans, we have a more complex situation. I consider that both animals and humans make sense of the variety of sights, sounds, and their affective state, and they need to coordinate this input and make association between one sense, sight, for example, and another, sound, for example. In the case of the dogs of Natalia, their behavior suggested that they were capable of relating what they saw, heard, and felt. For example, their nose licked more frequently when observing a negative facial expression and when observing this facial, than when observing a positive facial expression, and especially in humans. So this is an appeasement gesture, and we can hypothesize that it was a reaction to a threat exhibited in a prone conflict situation. Dogs were very sensitive to human behavior and to friendly or threatening communication signals. This is the result of a domestication process, which probably involved relatively intense selection for tameness. But in fact, I agree with you. Nonverbal and verbal communication are a case of multimodal communication, and the integration of these various dimensions is an interesting question.
Well, thank you. I hope, well, we are just in time, o'clock.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions. And, well, thank you, Emma, for your very interesting talk.
I'd like to thank Professor Sylvia Corte and Emma Otta for the lecture, for the discussion. Again, I'd like to remember you to sign our attendance list. The link is on the description of this video. It's very important for us for you to sign it, so we can know who were in our conference. Also, you can share the links of the conference with anyone you like, anyone that can be interested in that. It's an open link. Of course, the certificates are for the people who have registered, but the links are open, so you can share with anyone you think that would be interested in this conference. And now I'd like to call Adriana Hachiya, who is a I always forget this, it's not easy, ear, nose, and throat doctor from Hospital das Clínicas of University of São Paulo, that will introduce our next speaker. So, Adriana, you have the speech.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much it's a great pleasure to attend such a great meeting. And I would like to introduce the next speaker for this talk, who is Professor Domingos Hiroshi Tsuji. He's also an ENT, ear, nose, and throat physician, and he's a professor of the medicine school of the University of São Paulo, where he works intensively in the care of patients with voice problems, teaching residents and students, and also postgraduate students, and in research in laryngology. human laryngology. He's internationally recognized for his contribution in the human voice field. Patricia, I think you can share Professor Domingos' talk, and we'll be here after the conference for the questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to thank the organizers for this invitation. For me, it is a pleasure and a privilege to participate with you in this event. The objectives of this presentation is to talk a little about how the voice is produced, including air pressure as a source of energy, its transformation in sound energy through the vocal cords, and the phenomena of resonance and the articulation information of different phonemes. Speech is a linguistic activity that takes place through sounds produced by human speaking device in order to convey meanings. Meanings are transmitted through words formed by different phonemes that are formed by vowels and consonants. Here, I have represent some basic vowels and consonants, and here the term casa, the word casa, that means house in Portuguese, formed by the phonemes K, A, Z, and A, okay? The human voice can be defined as the sound produced by the human speaking apparatus under a complex coordination of several structures by the central neurological system, such as lung, here, the respiratory muscles, larynx and vocal cords, pharynx, tongue, soft palate, and uvula, lips, and jaw. Voice production can be divided at the peripheral level in 4 stages. The first corresponds to the primary energy source, represented by the respiratory system, that through specific respiratory muscle activities increase air pressure in the trachea below the level of the vocal cords. The second stage corresponds to the production of the fundamental sound of the larynx through the vibration of the vocal cords. The third stage corresponds to the resonance of the laryngeal sound when passing through the vocal tracts, that is the larynx, the pharynx, oral cavity, and the nasal cavities. This stage is fundamental for production of different vowels during voice production. The fourth stage, stage 4, corresponds to the articulation of the sound, which produces momentary interruption in the sound flow, generating different sounds that correspond to the consonants. Articulations involve structures such as tongue, teeth, lip, and palates. Here, I want to show the vocal tract from the inside seen with an endoscope. Here, the endoscope is going through the nasal cavity. Here we have the septum, nasal septum, turbinates, and here the nasopharynx structures. And here, this structure is the soft palate. And now, going down, we can see here the pharynx, the base of the tongue, the larynx, and the vocal folds here during voice emission. Here, okay? The vibration of the vocal fold, seen by a special device known as stroboscope, can show you the vibration of the vocal fold in slow motion. Okay? And here is the oral cavity. The endoscope is going through the oral cavity, and we are going down to see the vocal folds here, the larynx, okay, the pharynx, and the larynx with the vocal folds. Okay. The first stage of the voice production, which corresponds to the supply of a primary energy, depends on the lower respiratory system with its own physiology linked to a complex neuromuscular interaction that creates the air pressure necessary for phonation. Thanks to the contraction force of external and internal intercostal muscles, and to the contraction and the relaxation of the diaphragmatic muscle, the air enters and leaves the lung freely through the vocal tract or through the airway. However, if we interpose a point of constriction in any part of the vocal tract, there will be an interruption of the airflow and consequently an increase in air pressure below that location of constriction. And this is exactly what happens when the vocal folds assume their phonatory position. Here we have the respiratory position of the vocal fold, and here the phonation position. When the vocal cords closes the airway, there is an increase of pressure below the level of them. The interaction between the pressure power with the mechanical characteristics of the vocal folds will make them vibrate, producing the fundamental sound of the larynx, which is the basic sound of the voice. Here we have an endoscopic view of the larynx showing the main anatomical structure inside the larynx. Here the two vocal cords in a breathing position, keeping the airway open, and here we have the two vocal folds in a phonatory position ready for vibrating. The vocal cords is formed by a body made up mainly of the thyroid muscle and a cover made of mucous tissue. During the vibration, the mucous membrane vibrates in the form of a successive waves movement, while the muscular activity modulates how this vibration should occur. Let's see the vibration. You can observe here the wave movement of the mucous membrane that covers the vocal folds. Okay? The larynx is basically formed by a bone, the hyoid bone, and several cartilages listed here. Among these cartilages, the thyroid cartilage, which is this one from anterior view, this one from posterior view, cricoid, and two arytenoid cartilages are the most important for phonation. These cartilages are connected by ligament and muscles. Those muscles are called intrinsic muscles of the larynx. These muscles control the position of the vocal folds during the various physiological functions of the larynx, as during breathing, swallowing, and phonation. All of these muscles have some role in phonation, but the CT muscle and the TA muscle are particularly important. The action of the cricothyroid muscle, the CT muscle, elongates the vocal folds. When this muscle contracts, the thyroid cartilage is pulled forward and down, stretching the vocal folds. Under this condition, the vocal folds become thinner and tenser, leading to an increase in sound frequency, or it means high-pitched voice. Take a look at this video. Here is the CT muscle. And when this muscle contracts, the thyroid cartilage is pulled forward and down. And then, as a consequence, the vocal folds are stretched. And so doing, the vocal folds become thinner, and this is very important for production of high-pitched voices. On the other hand, the TA muscle can be considered a CT antagonist. In contraction, its contractions shortens the vocal folds, making it thicker, as you can observe here in this image, and the covering mucosa becoming more relaxed, like a looser elastic band. This situation lowers the sound frequency. Besides, the isometric contraction of the TA muscle is also very important to modulate the glottal resistance and consequently the intensity of the sounds. Concluding, this muscle is important to produce lower pitch voice and also to modulate the intensity of the sound produced. Here, you can see the vocal fold vibration, again, during a production of the E. And just to remember, the vocal fold in phonatory position vibrates under the effects of subglottic air pressure, producing what we call the fundamental sound of the larynx. Actually, this fundamental sound of the larynx is different from just the AI that you can hear here. Actually, the sound is very different from this A that you have just heard. Before proceeding, I would like to explain just one detail about two types of sounds: the pure sound and complex sound. The pure sound is produced when a rigid instrument like tuning fork vibrates, producing just a single sound frequency, which we call pure tone. But musical instruments like guitar or piano string, when vibrate, produce a type of sound called complex sound. The complex sound is formed by a set of sound waves of different frequencies. In a complex sound, the lowest frequency is called fundamental frequency, and the others are harmonic partials. These harmonics produced are related to integer multiples in relation to the fundamental frequency. These frequencies can be represented in this type of figure, where we have the fundamental frequency and the other harmonic represented here. When vocal folds vibrates like musical instruments, they produce a complex sound with its fundamental frequency and the harmonic partials. It is important to know that the fundamental frequency is the lowest and the strongest frequency in this group of sound waves, and is responsible for our perception of high or low pitch voices. In this particular example, you are listening to the vowel E recorded outside the mouth. So you are listening as a vowel E. Okay? But how would you hear the fundamental sound of the larynx without the influence of vocal tract? A long time ago, we did an experiment showing how the vibration of the vocal cords can be produced in excised larynx. As I said, vibration is due to mechanical interaction between the air pressure and the mechanical properties of the vocal folds. When the vocal folds are positioned properly and they interact with an adequate air pressure, they must vibrate. Let's see this video.
The actions of almost all intrinsic laryngeal muscles can be simulated by pulling the suture threads adequately fixed to the insertion of these muscles. The production of a laryngeal sound is a mechanical phenomenon and can be experimentally reproduced in excised larynges. The expiratory airflow can be simulated by an air injection from a compressed air tube into the trachea. The simulation of the contractions of the lateral cricoarytenoid and arytenoid muscles approximates vocal folds in the median line closing the glottic area. When the initial glottic area reaches an adequate value, the mechanical phenomenon of vocal fold vibration begins. It's noteworthy that small adjustments in the chord traction are able to lead to substantial changes in the sound characteristics. The use of stroboscopic light produces a slow motion picture of vocal fold vibration so that the vibratory characteristics can be observed in detail.
Let's just stop here, but I think that you could see in this experiment how is the fundamental sound is. As you could observe, the fundamental sound has no linguistic significance, but it is composed by its fundamental frequency and the other harmonic frequencies. Okay, now we can go to the third stage of the voice production, which is the resonance. What happens to this type of complex sound produced by the vocal folds that you have just heard when it passes through the vocal tract? As the vocal tract has the form of a tube, the sound waves of the larynx undergo the phenomenon of resonance. During this phenomenon, depending on the wavelength, some harmonics will have this intensity amplified and the other reduced. When it happens, the original spectrum of the laryngeal sound that can be represented like this will become a spectrum like this, with some amplified frequencies in red and the other attenuated ones in blue. Those amplified frequencies are called formant 1, 2, 3, and so on, and they represent the characteristic frequencies of each vowel that we usually have in our language. As an example, I have brought to you this sound. This fundamental sound is produced by these instruments. Here again. Okay, but when this fundamental sound goes through a plastic tube where the entrance is very narrow and the opening is wider, this sound becomes again. Instead of a wide, narrow entrance, if we have a wider entrance and the sound go through and the opening is narrow, the sound will become like this. Sorry. Again. Aí. So depending on the tube shape, this sound will be transformed in different kind of sounds. So when we are producing vowels in our language, our brain configures the vocal tracts in different ways to produce the specific characteristic formants needed for the vowel to be produced. As an example, this sound that was transformed in A, here in A. Take a look, this tube has the similar format of our vocal tract shape when we produce ah. Try produce ah, for example. You will observe that your mouth become opened and the posterior part of the pharynx will be narrowed. It is very difficult to observe this by yourself, but that is what really happens. And so on, okay? Finally, in the stage 4 of vocal production, the laryngeal sound transformed by the phenomenon of resonance undergo the phenomenon of articulation. This phase of vocal productions occurs through contacts between structures such as the lip, teeth, tongue, and palate, producing total or partial interruption of the airflow. These interruptions add distinct characteristics to the sound, resulting in different consonants. Here, the tongue is making contact with different structures, and the lips also make contact between them or with teeth and so on, okay? Some different points of articulations that produces different consonants are represented here. Actually, there are much more contact points than those represented here, and thanks to this, we have the countless consonants produced in different languages spoken by human species. This video is very interesting. Observing this video, the quick changes in the shape of the vocal tract and the articulation points. This video shows how complex and wonderful is the functioning of our vocal tract. Let's see this video.
Komm lieber Mai und mache die Bäume wieder grün und lass mir an dem Bache die kleinen Veilchen blühen. Wie möchte ich doch so gerne.
Observe how the vocal tract is quick to change its shape for producing different sounds. You can see the contact areas and also the format of the vocal tract, as you can observe, okay? Remember that everything is under control of the brain, or it means the software inside of the hardware is responsible for controlling everything. Finally, just a final consideration regarding voice in twin. Sansegund et al. Showed that the coefficient of similarity of a voice decreases when the family relationship between pairs of a voice diminished. That is, the similarity classification from highest to lowest was observed in the following scale of values: monozygotic twins, followed by dizygotic twins, followed by siblings, and finally unrelated persons. Actually, this work demonstrated what was already expected in some extent. That is, similar anatomical structures of the vocal tracts are more likely to produce similar voices. Okay, thank you very much. I hope it has, my presentation has shown some aspects of the voice production. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Domingos, for your talk. And I could see Patricia and Professor Anna's face. It's really amazing how to see how our vocal cords can produce a sound like it's just like how can I say a shaving removal, hair removal device, and it can be transformed to singing, for like singing voice with pheromones and the vocal tract and etc. It's really amazing, and I can watch Professor Domingos talk like several times, and I learn every time I watch his speech. We do have some questions about concerning this talk. First, Professor Domingos, thinking about anatomy, how do you know about genetic effects on form and function of cartilages and muscle on this vocal apparatus? And also, I would like to include a question about this. It's about the monozygotic twins, because they have the same vocal. They have the same vocal, the same vocal tract. Now, the same cartilages, they are monozygotic, the same vocal, the same size of the vocal fold, but they have different voices, as you told in your speech. What's the mainly factor that makes this person so different in their voice? It's the vocal apparatus, or the external environmental, such as culture, in his speech?
Thank you so much for your kind words. It's a pleasure, Dr. Emma, Patricia, Professor Ricardo, for inviting me. It's really amazing what are you doing, preparing in this event. Thank you so much. Considering the question, the genetic is, I think it is fundamental for determining how the cartilage and how the vocal cords will be when it is conceived during the human, when the human grows, okay? And so if you have two persons with similar genetic codes, probably the instruments that they have will be very similar. So I think that genetic will be different in the anatomical characteristic of each person. I don't know if that was the question, but it's fundamental, the code of genetic structures for making the voice tract, okay? I don't know if I have answered the question. And the second one was about the twins, yes? Regarding what would be the similarity or differences. We have to think that the voice is a mechanical phenomenon. The waves of the sounds go through the air thanks to mechanical compression, the rarefaction of the sound molecules, the air, and also the size and extension of our vocal tracts is also a mechanical phenomenon. So if the instrument that is producing this mechanical phenomenon is the same, probably the result will be the same, okay? So I do think that if you compare a pair of twins and they have the same vocal cords and the same vocal structures or vocal tract, probably the raw sound will be very similar. What I want to say, for example, the vocal fold has its own characteristics, okay? If you have two exactly equal vocal folds, probably the range of the frequency of the voice, I mean, from the lowest frequency or lowest pitch to the highest pitch, it means the extension of or range of the voice will be probably equal or very similar. also, I think that the range of intensity from the lowest intensity to the highest intensity emission will be very similar. Of course, these two parameters can be controlled by training. So if one person, although they have the same instrument, if one is more trained than the other, probably the performance will be better in those prepared or trained persons. Okay, but basically, for example, emission of E or A or E probably will be very, very similar among twins. I think that Dr. Emma, I think you can help me, but the brain depends a lot of experience history or passage history of each individual. So voicing also depends on the experience that each one has. So I think that even being twin, always you will have something that will be different. It means the software inside the brain that controls everything will be different among the two persons.
Now
I'm sorry.
we have, sorry for ending, but we have now the first twin head apart. One head in the north of Brazil and the other in northeast of Brazil during 23 years of life, and now they are together. We could see the similarities and differences between them.
I do think that probably the major difference is in resonance article, not in the phonation of this laryngeal sound, because the environment and the nationality or the regional influence are very important for changing the articulation, intonation, and the vowel characteristics. So I think that the environment will be very important. That's why when siblings are compared, they have a higher score of similarity because they are raised in a very similar environment. And you could, I think you notice that the twins, dizygotic twins have lower similarity than dizygotic twins. Probably because they were born on the same days, and the environment during the growing up period was the same. When you compare these two groups, two persons, dizygotic twins with siblings, dizygotics have a more similar voice than only siblings,
There are some more questions. There's one question from Patricia, and humans sometimes may intentionally produce sound during inspiration, just for fun, sounding like a robotic voice. What's the mechanism of production of such sounds? And I would add another question. There's from Gabriel. He has seen singers that want to go up or go down to a note to move their heads. What's the role of this head movimentation in shaping the vocal emission?
Two different questions. Please remember me if I forget to answer. The sound emission while you are inspirating the first form of phonation. It means that instead of the vocal fold vibrating in this direction from down to up, down, horizontal to up, during the inspiration phonation, it is in this direction. This is anyone. I think anyone is able to produce this sound, But we must remember that not only the vocal folds produce sounds, but also the palates, the lips, the tongue, all of those areas, when you make a constriction, they may vibrate during the airflow passage. So I think that the main structure is the vocal folds, but other structures may be involved. The other was singing. Could you repeat?
The other question is about singing. When the singer wants to reach a note, or to go up or to go down, they can make movements on their heads to shape the vocal tract. And
yes, I'm not very sure about the answer, but changing the position of the neck or the head can stimulate some other muscles around the larynx or even on the neck that can help to give more precision in voice emission. For example, the format of the vocal tract can be a little bit changed during your movements, and probably those very high technically developed singers have kind of very sensitive perception of their voice production. So I think that they use those movements just to help them to give the sound that they just want to produce at that specific interpretation. I think that is the way I can explain that.
And I think about also about the resonance. You see, sometimes you move your chin up, and it's better for you to sing like high notes. That's why because they feel more comfortable, and the resonance is better to reach that note with this kind of movement.
Okay, perfect. Just to comment on about the words vocal cords and vocal folds, I have seen many questions, many comments regarding this. Indeed, the correct words from the anatomical point of view, medical point of view, is vocal folds, because instead of being a cord, a simple cord, it's more like a fold, or in Portuguese, prega, like like this in your how can I say, your clothes, okay? That is why they call vocal folds. However, I'm used to use these vocal cords because there are some terms used in medical area. For example, we never say in Portuguese foldite. We say cordite when we want to refer to the vocal fold inflammation. Cordite, we never say vocal pregite, pregite de corda vocal. We never say. So even in medical area or anatomical scientific papers, we say cordite instead of foldite. So I think that we can keep using these cordas vocais or vocal cords, because this term is very popular and the people can understand it very well. So I keep using, especially with my patients. But when you write a thesis, please write vocal folds, okay?
I think we have all the answers, all the questions answered. I don't know if you have any other questions concerning this talk.
I have seen a question of the vocals stay during respiration. They keep always open, okay? And the PCA muscle, which is the only muscle that keeps the vocal folds in lateral position, stay all the time contract, keeping the vocal folds open or the glottis open for respiration. Okay.
Can we finish the session, Patricia? Can we? Okay. So I would like to thank and congratulate the organization on behalf of the discipline of otorhinolaryngology of our university. And it's a very honorable to be here to attend this Congress. And I would like to thank you, Professor Domingos, also for his talk. And it was very interesting for us because we can see different areas, different talks that we are used to watch. And we have the common interest in that is vocalization and communication. And it was really amazing to attend and to be here with you. And thank you very much for your invitation.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Professor Domingos Hiroshi and Dr. Adriana Hachiya for this great talk. I'm a singer myself, and I always look up when I'm trying to reach high notes. So I got very curious about it, but I have no theoretical knowledge about this. I think now we have some time, so we can take a 10-minute break. We come back here in 10 minutes. What do you think? 15:34, we are back. Okay? So I guess we are back. First thing, I want to remind you to sign our attendance list. Some people were asking, we have one attendance list for each period. So one this morning, one this afternoon, one tomorrow morning, and another one tomorrow afternoon. Okay? And now I want to call the next moderator, that is Professor Rogério Grassetto Teixeira da Cunha, a primatologist interested in bioacoustic from Universidade Federal de Alfenas. He will introduce our next speaker. So, Professor Rogério, you have the word now.
Thank you, Vinicius. It's actually my great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Bowling, who is currently an instructor at the School of Medicine at Stanford University. Dr. Bowling is a neuroscientist focused on working on auditory vocal function in human social communication. His areas of expertise and interests cover a broad range of topics, ranging from psychological, neurobiological, and acoustic perspectives on both speech and music, their convenience of affect, social significance, and origins in mammalian vocal behavior. He combines psychophysiological, psychoacoustic, neuroendocrine, and pharmacological methods to study perception and behavior in human subjects. And for us to have an idea of his breadth of interests, his most recent papers ranged from the evolution of the primate larynx, the current topic of the talk today, to the pupillometry of groove music, studying the link between music and movement. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the talk about the rapid evolution of the primate larynx and the source filter theory. Please, Dr. Bowling.
Okay, thank you very much, Rogério, for the kind introduction, and thank you to Patricia for putting this conference together and for inviting me to speak. I'm going to launch into this now. So everybody can see my screen, I think. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking to you about some of my work on the evolution of the voice. Okay, I've been asked to say a little something about source filter theory at the beginning. I imagine that a lot of this is review for people here, so I'm going to go over it pretty fast. But I'm just going to start. Here's a cross-section of the human head showing the larynx, which is the source of the voice, and the filter, the vocal tract, which filters the voice. Here's an example. I'm just going to play you a sound of a recording made down near the larynx. Okay, it sounds really buzzy, almost kind of mechanical. You have the spectrum here showing this characteristic fall off of amplitude with increasing harmonic number. And here's also the waveform of the glottal pressure changes. Okay, and what happens is these pressure variations get moved up into the vocal tract, which acts as a resonant cavity that filters these harmonic frequencies, resulting in an output spectrum that is the combination of these two things. It shapes the source spectrum to create a different output waveform. You move from the sound we heard earlier to something like this. Okay. The filter has traditionally received a lot of attention in human speech research because it does so much of the vowel production. So this is a very dynamic space. We can change it by moving the tongue all around, by opening and closing our mouth, by opening and closing the nasal passages with a soft palate. And this allows us to produce an incredible variety of sounds. That being said, of course, the filter is doing, the source is also doing something very complex, right? So this is a recording of me just saying a couple of sentences, and this is a trace of the fundamental frequency. So the larynx is constantly changing the tension on the vocal folds, very fine-grained adjustments of frequency over time, and it's also stopping and starting very precisely in speech. So both the source and the filter combine in very complex ways to allow us to do what I'm doing right now. In terms of bioacoustics, what's really cool about source filter theory is how broad...
Sorry, Daniel.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry just to interrupt you. Are you presenting slides or your... Because we can't see your slides, just your... you talking. If you can start a presentation, please.
Okay.
Sorry for interrupting.
No problem. I am starting the presentation, but maybe I need to share my screen here.
Yeah, I think you need to share your screen.
No, thank you. All right.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you for letting me know. Okay, here we go. Great. Okay, so I'll just show you quickly here. Okay, talking about the evolution of the voice, source filter theory. Here we go. Source filter. Okay, all the different vocal tract shapes we can make. Here's a recording of me speaking, vocal fundamental frequency changing over time. Okay, I was saying, so in bioacoustics, what's really cool is how broadly this source filter theory applies. So here's just an example of some different vertebrates. We've got a squirrel, a frog, and a newt here, or a gecko, and you can see everyone uses the same basic system to produce vocalizations. We've got air coming through the trachea from the lungs, flowing through the larynx, setting vocal folds or vocal cords into vibration and producing the voice. In birds, the situation is a little different. Instead of a larynx, they have something called the syrinx, which rests deep in their belly, just above the lungs at the bottom of the trachea. But again, it's air flowing through there, tissue vibrating that's producing sound. So source filter theory really helps us understand how many animals vocalize. And when we look at the diversity that we see in the animal kingdom, it's really valuable for helping us understand what's going on. So here's an example: red deer. Red deer, when they bugle, they pull their larynx way down into their chest, and that has the effect of elongating their vocal tract, producing deeper resonances. We have the hammerhead bat, which has a massive, gigantic larynx that fills pretty much its whole chest, produces very low frequencies. The howler monkey's celebrated example in bioacoustics, giant larynx, very low frequency roars. There's something very interesting going on in the birds as well, a phenomenon called tracheal elongation. Again, because the source of their voice rests at the bottom of their vocal tract. They have this very elongated trachea in a lot of species. This trumpet manicote is a really bizarre example of this, where you have this coiled trachea. This has the effect of lengthening the vocal tract, lowering the resonant frequencies. Okay, so why is this similar system so apparent across all these creatures? Well, it's because we're all related. So if you go back to the most basal air-breathing vertebrate that we can get our hands on today, the lungfish, what you see is that the primitive larynx is essentially a safety valve. It's very simple. It's just a tube coming out of their lungs, and it has a little valve on the end, and it protects the lungs from being flooded with water. So now if you fast forward 400 million years or so to our last common ancestor with the lungfish, you get something much, much more complex. So the human larynx is a complex of cartilage and ligaments and membranes and muscles, and they're all under direct descending control of primary motor cortex, and this is what allows us to speak. So the question really, the fundamental question is, how do we get from here to here? What is the process of evolution that has given rise to this organ that allows us to do so much with each other? And that brings us to this paper here. Okay, so this was published in PLOS Biology earlier this year. And what we wanted to do in this work was take a comparative approach to voice evolution. And we wanted to start really simple, because although people have looked at the larynx across species, of course, no one has really attempted to do it systematically in terms of specific measurements and incorporating what we know about evolutionary phylogeny. So we want to start by just a simple comparison, two different groups. Okay, so we're humans. We kind of care most about ourselves. We knew we wanted to look at primates. And for this, we wanted the other group to be balanced with primates in terms of factors that could plausibly influence larynx evolution. Things like habitat, the social systems we have, and also body size. So for this, we chose carnivorans. They also live in terrestrial and arboreal habitats. They live in solitary, some live in solitude, some live in large groups, and they also range over a similar range, hundreds of grams to hundreds of kilograms. Okay, so now what we needed to do was get a bunch of primate larynges and a bunch of carnivoran larynges. And this was really made possible by collaboration started by Tecumseh Fitch at the University of Vienna and Andrew Kitchener at the National Museum Scotland. And over 10 years ago, they worked something out where we could start to amass a collection of larynges. And this has involved a lot of other people over the years. Basically what happens is when an animal dies at a zoo in Europe, very frequently its body gets shipped to Edinburgh, where this gentleman here does the painstaking work of preserving its skin and its bones for the museum's collection. Okay, it's really incredible. I've been up there. They have such a variety of specimens. It's amazing. What Tecumseh and Andrew worked out was that when he does this, he should excise the larynx, put it on ice, and ship it to us. And so that's what we've done. So in Vienna, we take these larynges out, we clean them, we position them, and we use them for a variety of different things. All the specimens in this study came to us in this fashion. We also use them for these excised larynx experiments where we blow moist air through the larynx to actually phonate it and study its vibration. Doing this, we've amassed over 300 different specimens, okay? Coming back to our study now, we wanted to select a subset of these specimens to use. We ended up selecting about 55. And the way that we based our selection on body size, essentially, because you think body size is really going to dominate how big the larynx can be. We wanted to have a range of body sizes, cover the range for primates. So here we have, each data point here represents one particular specimen, and we have 26 of them for primates, ranging from the pygmy marmoset to the chimpanzee in size. Gorilla is a little bit bigger. It just so happened that our chimpanzee was a little longer. This is the gorilla here. We did the exact same thing for carnivorans here. Okay, carnivorans a little bit of a broader size. And we have everything from a common dwarf mongoose down here to a Sumatran tiger. Okay, this is showing the phylogeny of all 55 of our species. We were able to make this selection while obtaining a fair degree of phylogenetic diversity. We have represented here for the carnivores members of 9 of the 12 extant families. For primates, we have members of 7 of the 12 extant families. So, you know, it's not totally comprehensive, but it's what we could do with our sample. But, you know, we've got a problem. We've got basically a mess of larynges of all different sizes, and we want to really do something rigorous and systematic. So how can we approach this problem? Well, we decided to generate computer models on the basis of CT scans. And for this, we engaged our colleagues, Dr. Michaela Gumpenberger at the University of Veterinary Medicine, Vienna, and her colleagues, Sabina Dang and Stefan Hanschu. And what they did for us was scan all these larynges and then give us the data that we could use to create computer models. So this is just one of the models. This is from a gibbon, and we're showing the larynx here from the front and from the back, and then again a sagittal section here, and the different principal cartilages and bones here. So CT is based on X-rays. It really allows you to see mineral content, so mineralized things like bone and mineralized cartilages. The primary cartilages that we were concerned about, cricoid cartilage, thyroid cartilage, arytenoid cartilages, and also the hyoid bone. And we developed a detailed measurement protocol for characterizing these things very systematically. We wanted to be able to do this for every specimen the exact same way. And so we said, okay, well, we're always going to place a landmark, for example, here at the tip of the arytenoids and here in the middle of the thyroid cartilage at the front. And then from these landmarks, we derived very specific measurements. 10 measurements in total. This one that I mentioned to you here is our proxy for vocal fold length between the arytenoids and the thyroid. And we did this for every larynx in our set. We put these measurements into a principal components analysis. And we could see right away that the first principal component accounted for a huge variety of the variation in our measurements, already 91% of the variation. This principal component received very high loading from all 10 measurements. Average was 0.95. So what this means is this PC1 is essentially larynx size, and that's what we're going to call it. Okay, this is kind of a crude measure, but again, we wanted to start simple, and we really weren't sure what we were going to find. So now on to the results of this study. So first thing is I'm going to show you is a plot of larynx size, this first principal component we just derived, against the body length of our specimens. So here's the data for primates. See a very strong relationship ranging from down here. We got our pygmy marmoset to our gorilla up here and our chimpanzee. But what's really interesting is now when we do the carnivores. So right away, what you can see is that carnivores follow a very similar relationship, but it appears to be shifted. Okay, so we can approach this statistically using something called phylogenetic ANCOVA. This allows us to compare the slopes and the intercepts of these lines while also controlling for the fact that these data points aren't independent, right? So they're related. We need to incorporate that into the analysis, and that's what this does. When you do this, you see what we see with our eyes. So these lines have similar slopes. They're not significantly different, but the intercepts are different. They're very different. We did some other measurements looking at different pairs of these animals to assess what this difference really is and put a number on it. Turns out that for a similar sized body, the primate larynx is about 1.4 times larger than the carnivoran larynx on average. Okay, to give you a kind of intuitive feel for what this is, here are two specimens from our sample, a siamang and a red fox, very similar in terms of their size. Body length is less than 3 centimeters different, but you can see this massive difference in the larynx, right? So the siamang's larynx is much, much larger than the fox. Okay, so on to our second result, which is really about how variable the size of the larynx is in these two different groups. So for this analysis, we're going to just look at a single regression line. Okay, I'm going to put this back here now, this phylogeny, and we're just going to be looking at the residuals. Okay, so the residuals from this purple line. If you do it for the carnivores, not surprisingly, all the residuals are pretty much negative. They're all below this line. Do it for the primates, you see something very different. So they're mostly above this line. Not only that, but if you look at the pattern of variation in these residuals, it looks like the primate residuals are more variable. And this is something we've been able to quantify using some fairly complex stats that allowed us to incorporate the phylogeny. But the bottom line is that the primates here exhibit more variability. And that variability is greater than observed in the carnivores by a factor of about 2.2, and it's significant. Not only this, okay, so I want to focus a little bit more on these primates and talk about two other things that we found. So not only do we find evidence for this grade shift between primates and carnivores, these percentages indicate support for how confident we can be about these grade shifts. So we have this major increase, we have this difference in size between primates and carnivores here, but also within the primate sample that we had, there's evidence for two other grade shifts. So here, what we see is that the atellid primates, which include the howler monkeys and also their close cousins, spider monkeys, seem to have larger larynges than you would expect, even with respect to other primates. Okay, and we see something else is true as well. So for these guys down here, the papionine primates, which include our baboons and our macaques, they seem to be shifted in the other direction. So they have smaller larynges than you would expect based on primates. So again, this just speaks to the variability. There was no evidence of other grade shifts among the carnivorans, but in primates, there seems to be this variation. Okay, just quickly, I want to mention some controls that we did. So when we did these analyses, it's possible that they could have been corrupted by the sex of our specimens, the age of our specimens. If we had immature animals, that there were carnivores, and mature animals that were primates. Also, what if there are major differences in sexual dimorphism between primates and carnivores? And that's what we're really seeing here. We incorporated variables representing each of these possible confounds into analyses, and we found that none of them had any significant impact on this relationship. So it basically means that these results are unlikely to be driven by these factors. We also repeated this again, this whole analysis, using mass instead of length. It's possible that this could just be a confound of using length as our proxy for body size. Maybe carnivorans just have longer bodies, but it's not true. The same pattern holds when you do it for mass. Okay, so on to our final analysis here, which is about evolutionary rate. So what I'm going to do now is take these residuals here and just rotate that axis, put it over here. And so you see the primates up here, they all have positive residuals, mostly anyways, and the carnivorans are down here, they mostly have negative residuals. So because we know the evolutionary history approximately of this, we can estimate the divergences of these in this tree and when they occurred in time. We can plot the rate of change of these different, that would have been necessary to achieve this pattern of variation that we see today. And when you do this, basically you can compare the slopes of these different lines. Okay? You can estimate what these different distributions of slopes look like. And you can see that in order to reach the pattern of variation that we observe today, primate larynges would have had to evolve much more rapidly than carnivoran larynges. And so we have this difference in the rate of evolution of primate larynx size. Primate larynges have evolved more rapidly. So that brings us kind of to the end of the results. Just to summarize, compared to carnivoran larynges, primate larynges are 1, larger, 2, they're more variable, and 3, they evolve more rapidly. So these are fundamental things about the evolution of the primate larynx that we've learned, but it's important to say that we don't know what the underlying cause for these differences are. And what we can say is that primate larynges appear to be fundamentally less constrained by body size. And what this means is that any change in the balance of selective pressures that maintains relative larynx size is likely to increase the diversity in larynx size that you see in primates. Primates are very likely to respond to these changes by becoming more diverse. And maybe that has something to do with the complexity in the vocal systems that we see in primates. What we can also say is that this difference in flexibility, any changes that would have happened in larynx size, very likely to have affected vocal communication. So this is just a simple graph looking at our larynx size measure plotted against the fundamental frequency of species-typical vocalizations from all our animals. You can see that, again, you have this very strong relationship. This is also true if you look at the residuals of larynx size from body length. Those are also related to the vocal frequencies. So what that means is that all of these kind of phylogenetic patterns I've been discussing are also likely to have had impact on vocal communication systems. But again, to return to this fundamental question, so what's going on here? What changes in selection pressures could have driven our results? Okay, I think here we really have to be very open-minded because the truth is we don't know. And you can propose major adaptive hypotheses for every major function of the larynx. So the larynx doesn't only function in vocal communication, it also acts to protect the airway during feeding. It also acts to regulate air supply to the lungs. So just to give you a taste of how much, the theory that we can go after here, primates and carnivores, very different diets, right? So maybe the threat of choking by swallowing large hunks of minimally chewed meat puts pressure on the carnivoran larynx to be small. This could be true. It would explain the overall size difference that we observed, but it wouldn't necessarily explain the difference in the size variation we see. It's also worth noting that not all carnivorans are strictly meat eaters. We've got pandas, for example, bears that only eat bamboo. Not all primates strictly eat plants, right? So you got tarsiers, for example, primarily feed on insects. When it comes to regulating the air supply, what about differences in locomotion? So primates tend to be more arboreal than carnivores. They're swinging through trees. The larynx plays a role in stiffening the thorax. So if you think about lifting weights, for example, you hold your breath, breathe in your lungs, you hold your breath, kind of holds your thorax together. Maybe this has something to do with swinging through branches. Maybe that creates differences in pressure. We can think about this a little bit because we have some arboreal carnivores in our sample. And when you look at these arboreal carnivores, it's not the case that they have more primate-like larynges. Their larynges are just like the other carnivores. So that's kind of a point against this. However, the papillon primates, which are the most terrestrial in our sample, they do have smaller, kind of more carnivorous type larynges. So maybe something is going on there. Within the realm of vocal communication, there's a lot of different ways to think about these results. Acoustic adaptation, so again, primates tend to be more arboreal, lower frequencies transmit better through forest environments. Maybe that explains the larger size of primate larynges, wouldn't account for the variation we observed. What about sexual selection and body size exaggeration like we see in howler monkeys? Maybe that is playing a role. It's certainly playing a role in howler monkeys. So again, here we didn't have any systematic differences in the sex of our specimens between primates and carnivores. We also didn't find differences in sexual dimorphism between these groups. Last thing was social complexity. So this was something we were really interested in. Maybe the difference between primates and carnivores is related to the fact that primates tend to live in larger groups. They tend to use their voice a lot, and maybe this increased use requires a more robust, framework to deal with all the increased forces from using your voice all the time. We approach this in a fairly simple way, using group size as a measure of social complexity. Not a great measure, but it's accessible, so we looked at it. When we did this, we found that it is indeed true that our primates have larger group sizes and more variable group sizes actually than our carnivorans, but this turned out not to be related to the differences in vocal and larynx size that we observed. And this makes sense if you think about it just intuitively. Like howler monkeys, they have some of the largest larynges, but they don't live in particularly big groups, whereas these baboons, they live in huge groups and they have some of the smallest larynges. So it doesn't seem to really line up that well. So the bottom line here is that we've now found that these clear differences exist, but we really don't know why. And probably it's a mix of different factors. Okay, so just briefly in closing, I want to say something about the future of this work. Fundamentally, we need more mammalian clades. Okay, so we just looked at the primates here and the carnivorans, and that allows us to make this relative statement, well, primates evolved more rapidly than carnivores. Well, yeah, but how special are we really? We can't, maybe carnivores are just really slow, right? So we need to look at a lot more clades in order to understand what's going on, to be able to say that primates are exceptional if indeed they are. And this work is really being spearheaded by my colleague, Jacob Dunn at Anglia Ruskin University in the UK. He runs a group called the Primate Evolution and Ecology Research Group, and he'll basically scan anything he can get his hands on in order to try to build up this, our ability to get phylogenetic context for understanding the evolution of this organ. Okay, so that pretty much brings me to the end of my talk. I really want to thank all of these different people here. This was a huge collaborative effort, not only between Vienna and Scotland and the veterinary university, but also somebody I didn't mention was Jeroen Smers, who was really instrumental in allowing us to approach our results with phylogenetic sophistication. He's an expert in phylogenetic comparative methods. And I'd also like to thank our funders, so Austrian FWF, the Royal Society in the UK, and the Nagani Foundation and the Rhinology and Laryngology Fund, which are both in the United States. Thank you for your attention, and thanks for being here. Okay, let's do that. Okay, great. Stop presenting.
Okay, that's better. Dr. Bowling, thank you for such an interesting talk. It was beyond my expectation. I think I could grab a beer and end up discussing all your hypotheses for a whole afternoon and evening. But we have our 20 minutes.
Yes, indeed.
So I'll try to summarize some of the questions. And
Sure.
Dr. Maria Luisa, she asked if some of the differences that we see, because we have huge differences in some closely related species, if that couldn't be adaptive, since they are closely related and so divergent in terms of larynx structure. And I think related to that, she was wondering if what you're measuring, what exactly are you measuring influence, how exactly what you're measuring influences the frequency and amplitude.
Right,
I mean,
right.
just the
Yeah.
metaphor was clear.
Right. Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think that it's a really fruitful area for future research. You can go and you can look at really related species where you have a massive difference, ideally get more than one larynx per species and make some comparisons. What we are measuring is we have this principal component larynx size, but it's really how it affects the voice is really in that dimension vocal fold length, right? So as the larynx gets bigger and you lengthen the vocal folds, it changes the range of frequencies that you can produce. And that's kind of just the first level of relationship between the anatomy and the voice that we can study. You can also do a lot more sophisticated stuff, right? So we can start to look at the actual morphology of the different cartilages and how they're shaped and start to get some insight between those fine anatomical differences and the differences in the voice that we see, things like amplitude, things like the shape of the glottal pulse. But this is all in the area of future research at present.
Excellent. And Dr. Aline Gasco, she studies coatis, and she asked if in the case of the middle-sized carnivores, how different are their vocal tract from the primates?
Great question. I don't know because I don't have the data. There's a reason why we chose to do this starting with the larynx, right? Well, we could CT scan these and we can model them. The vocal tract is a lot more complicated. You can't just excise the larynx. You've got to have the whole animal, the whole torso, and scan it and model that shape. It would be so cool to be able to do, and I hope somebody will do it someday. But for now, we don't know.
Okay. And Dr. Suemi Tokumaru, she asks if could the selection pressure be related to differences in locomotion? Primates are arboreal and have a more upright posture than carnivores. And I would add to that something I was noticing, that the Papionines, if the environment couldn't have something to do, because the Papionines have the smallest larynx and live in open country habitat, such as most carnivores do. So both questions in one.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a very plausible hypothesis, and I think we're in this realm of it's all theory. We can just talk about these ideas, and it's very difficult to try to triangulate exactly what's going on in evolution. What we really need to do is target those hypotheses with specific comparisons, right? So get your arboreal carnivores, get your terrestrial carnivores, get your arboreal primates, get your terrestrial primates, get lots of different examples, and do the comparison to test those hypotheses specifically. I think that that's a plausible alternative to say vocal communication hypotheses, but maybe both are related as well. We just don't know.
Okay, I think that was the part of the talk that people just started putting ideas and questions because everybody became so interested in all those hypotheses. And Dr. Gabriel Francescoli, he asked if these differences in sound production and voice evolution could be related to differences at the level of the receiving part or the hearing structures and or analysis zones in the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess we tend to think about these things in terms of coevolution, but in terms of what's driving what, it's not so clear, right? Across a lot of different species, you see alignment, right, between the auditory system and the vocal system. specialized tuning of what we hear into the range that the animals are vocalizing in. But yeah, how can we approach that question? How can we can maybe compare rates, right? If you had some proxy for evolution in the auditory system and the evolution in the vocal system, you could look at the different rates at which they evolve. Maybe one's evolving faster, and then you could try to say, well, that's more likely to be the driver. In terms of the brain stuff, definitely. I mean, you know, there's been a lot of work on morphology and vocal morphology and acoustics, but I think ultimately what's going on is we learn more about other animals and we see, wow, they're really doing really complicated stuff with their vocal systems, very fine control of laryngeal movement, and in the vocal tract, they can move their tongue around, they can make vowel sounds. So we need to understand what's different in the brain and what's going on there. And at least for humans, the current story seems to be that we have this direct descending control from primary motor cortex that allows us to not only learn how to make different sounds, but to do it flexibly. We're not constrained by existing, by things that we're born with.
Ok. Ficou mudo para todos? Não? Estão me ouvindo?
Agora estou ouvindo.
Okay. Dr. Bowling, we have two more questions, but first, one for myself. I would like to know, in your regression line that you showed us, where do humans fit? Are we on the line, above the line, below the line?
Right. Great question. I really wanted to get a human larynx for this study. We didn't get one. Let's see. Yeah, I think, you know, from just like my own intuitions, looking at you know, models of the human larynx and where it fits, I think it's pretty standard. I think we'd be right around there with we'd be above the regression line for all species like other primates, but around the chimpanzee and the gorilla. The other thing is that we have sexual dimorphism in our larynx, right? So men and women are really different starting in puberty, and so men would probably be further above than women typically. Great question.
Okay. And now more specific questions. I think we have a couple of more minutes, if you don't mind.
No problem.
And Dr. Patricia Monticelli, she asks, do you know how is the larynx that allows the singing rat to sing?
Yeah. So I have a colleague who just did her PhD on this. It's really cool. Yeah. So they have these things called, like, I think they're called vocal lips. It's like a very, very thin filaments on the edges of the vocal folds that I think we don't totally understand the bioacoustic mechanisms completely, but they can vibrate at very, very fast. And, you know, that kind of gets to another point, which is like, you know, we did this gross morphological study, but these fine details, the evolution in these soft tissues, can really tell us a lot as well. And that's also a challenge for future research.
Okay. And one more question from myself now. I was interested if you have some comment on those carnivores that seem to be going up. It was very fast, this slide, but seemed that the Pantera cluster, they are getting very close to the...
Yeah, let me see. So, here, should I show my... Oh, well, you're talking about the about carnivores that have large larynges, or is that correct? I think I lost you there for a second.
Yeah, I think it seemed to me that the Pantera cluster were having larger larynxes than the average.
No, you're totally right. In fact, actually, in some of the alternate models that we tested, in the next best model, the Panthera there was a potential, there was a trend towards another grade shift for the Panthera to have even larger larynges. And the pantheras have these, like the lions have these massive vocal pads. Their vocal folds are really different. And maybe this has to do with they're doing all this roaring at night, right, where it gets dark, and they're basically, it could be a body size exaggeration thing, right, where they're being like, don't come over here because I'm big and scary, essentially. But yeah, that's cool that you saw that. I didn't mention it.
Okay, just two more questions. We're nearly close to our time. Dr. Aline, she asks, she first comments that when we are looking for emotion encoding in vocalizations, we can usually extract formant values. But when the vocal apparatus produce voiced sounds, we don't analyze formants. So, her question is, in complex, high-frequency calls of carnivores, why it's not possible to find formant frequencies?
When you have a high-frequency vocalization, right, so you have sparse harmonics, right? You don't have a broadband sound that nicely fills the resonances. But you can see formants in carnivoran vocalizations that are not tonal, that are hisses or growls. So I think that's a really interesting area for the research as well.
Okay, and the last one, and Dr. Suemi, she asked if you have tried correlations of larynx size with sociality.
Yeah, so I really want to do this with more sophistication. It's really hard to measure sociality, right? So we try to do it with group size. There's been a lot of work on this with brain size, obviously. So there's more that we could have done there, but just as a first approximation, we decided to do it with group size, and we didn't see that. This was our working hypothesis going into this. This is all really about social function, but it didn't pan out, at least with group size. I think that you could start to look at relationship quality, right? And how many quality relationships do you have? How many coalitions do you form? You might start to get some more insight into that. But again, there's this weird thing, right? So the howlers, these huge larynges, they live in small groups. The baboons, they have these tiny larynges, they live in huge groups. So something more interesting is going on, if indeed there's something related to sociality.
Okay, Dr. Bolling, once again, thank you for such an interesting talk.
Thank you so much.
You couldn't imagine how was the chat. It was just like, bursting with activity. People are just having loads of ideas, and Dr. Aline, she's offering you a suggestion to work with coatis because they are fascinating studies. Awesome. I don't know why she finds that, and they would be an excellent model. And she's offering for partnerships, and because they are social carnivores that behave almost like primates, according to her.
Very cool.
And also Patricia has reminded us that people have proposed several indexes of sociality, which of course would be a very nice starting point.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak with you today. It's really great to do this in the middle of this COVID disaster, and I really appreciate it. And feel free to shoot me an email. I can also put you in touch with my colleague, Jacob Dunn, who's doing a lot of this stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bolling. Vinicius?
Ciao.
Thank you, Professors Daniel Bolling and Rogério da Cunha, for this speech and the discussion. It was a very, very interesting talk. Right now, we are going to our last speech today. I'd like to call our next moderator, Professor Plínio Barbosa. He's a linguist from Universidad Estadual de Campinas, and he works in collaboration with Professor Patrícia Monticelli, that is the organizer of this great event. So, Professor Plínio, you have the word.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation, not only for today, but also for tomorrow again. May I already introduce the next speaker, Bruna? Should I do now? Introducing? Okay. Then, on behalf of the organization team, it's my pleasure to introduce you Bruna Campos, who will present her work entitled Identify Motions from Voice. Bruna Campos is a biologist who works in a project for implementing systems of bioacoustics monitoring and analysis of animal vocalizations. She collaborates with the Ethology Acoustic Lab at the University of São Paulo at Ribeirão Preto, where she got a master's thesis on vocal behavior of many wolves. Bruna's presentation is a pre-recorded video, but she's here for answering your questions. Please.
I'm going to talk today about how to identify emotions from human voice. The human voice can be characterized by several attributes. These attributes can be pitch, timbre, loudness, and vocal tone. It has often been observed that humans express the emotion by very different vocal attributes during speech generation. But today, I will concentrate on the acoustic cues. So, to begin, I will talk about the approach to evaluate the emotional expression. At first, I would like to present a summary of the topic which I will talk to you today. I will present some concepts about the emotion. Next, I will talk about the theories of emotion, expression of emotion, human voice, and finally, about the acoustic parameters behind the emotions. Emotion can be defined as an episode of interrelated synchronized change in the states of all or most of the 5 organismic subsystems in response to the evaluation of external or internal stimulus as relevant to major concern of the organism. The emotion is an affective experience that accompanies generalized inner adjustment and mental and physiological stirred up states in the individual, and that shows itself in the overt behavior. The emotion have 2 components, a physical reaction and a conscious experience of feeling. The emotion is controlled by endocrine glands, autonomic nervous systems, and the brain. The empirical investigation of the effect of emotion on the voice started at the beginning of the 20th century, with psychiatrists trying to diagnose emotional disturbs through the newly developed methods of the electroacoustic analysis. However, systematic research programs started in the 1960s when psychiatrists renewed their interest in diagnosing affective states via vocal expression. Emotion psychologists charted the expression of emotion in different modalities. Linguistics and particularly phoneticians discovered the importance of pragmatic information in speech, and engineers and phoneticians specializing in acoustic signal process started to make use of ever more sophisticated technology to study the effects of emotion on the voice. Exists many theories of emotion, and for all purposes I discuss 4 theories of emotion. The evolutionary approach is closely related to discrete emotions theories, according to which each discrete emotion is thought to represent a unique interaction with the environment with its adaptational significance for the individual. The emotions evolved because they were adaptive. Emotion motivate the human to respond quickly to stimuli, which improve the chance of success and survival. From this perspective, emotions have evolved to deal with relevant changes in your environment and may be described as relatively brief and intense reactions to these changes. Emotional expression can be separated into modules as anger, fear, happiness, and sadness. These modules have grounded the theoretical approach of the concept of the basic emotions, which propose that some aspects of the body and face involve as adaptation to mediate specific contexts. The James Lange theory was proposed by William James and Carl Lange. They say that felt emotion is the perception of bodily changes. However, the theory has many criticisms. Most occasion emotion occurs immediately after stimulus in case of less intense emotions. In this case, the bodily patterns can't be perceived, or with the same physiological arousal, people can be experience different emotions. The Cannon bar theory was proposed by Walter Cannon and Philip Pard. They proposed that an emotion-triggering stimulus and body's arousal take place simultaneously. Walter Cannon and Philip Pard questioned the James Lange theory and seems to have been accurate in its rejection of James Lange theory. The Shorter-Singer two-factors theory of emotion is another variation on theory of emotions that takes into account both physiological arousal and emotional experience. According to this theory, emotion is composed of two factors, physiological and cognitive. In other words, physiological arousal is interpreted in context to produce the emotional experience. A more recent theory is about appraisal evaluation of emotion. The key idea of appraisal theory is that you have thought, a cognitive appraisal, before you experience an emotion. If you think something is positive, you'll have more positive emotion about it than if your appraisal was negative, and the opposite is true. Appraisal theories explain the way two people can have two completely different emotions regarding the same event. Another perspective is the dimensional approach, which has mostly concentrated on one component of emotion, the subjective feeling state, and focuses on identifying emotion based on their placement on a small number of underlying dimensions. Dimensional approach suggests that the subjective feeling can be described by the position in a three-dimensional space formed by the dimensions of violence, arousal, and tension. Expression of emotion includes the vocal expression that makes possible the evaluation of the emotion through the acoustic structure of the sound or specific vocal types. The vocal, like a facial expression, are nonverbal behavior that can be used to infer the emotional state. The approach to study the communication through the expression of the emotion or arousal consider the signal as an indicator of emotional or motivational state. During speech communication, listening attempts to change in pitch, loudness, rhythm, and voice quality to form an impression about the speaker's emotional state in conjunction with linguistic decoding. The human voice is a diverse and nuanced source of emotional signaling. The voice consists of sound produced by a human being using the vocal folds for carrying out acoustic activities such as talking, singing loudly, shouting, etc. The human voice frequency is specifically a part of the human sound production mechanisms in which the vocal cord or folds are primary source of generation sound. Other sound production mechanisms produced from the same general area of the body involve the production of unvoiced consonants, clicks, whistling, and whispering. Generally, the mechanism for generating the human voice can be subdivided into three parts: the lungs, the vocal folds with the larynx, and the articulators. The human voice and the associated speech patterns can be characterized by a number of attributes, the primary ones being pitch, loudness, and sound pressure, timbre, and tone. Pitch is an auditory sensation in which a listener assigns musical tones to relative position on a musical scale based primarily on the perception of the frequency of vibration. Pitch can be quantified as a frequency, but it's based on the subjective perception of a sound wave. Sound oscillation can be measured to obtain a frequency in hertz or cycle per second. The pitch is independent of the intensity or amplitude of the sound wave. Loudness is a subjective perception of sound pressure and can be defined as an attribute of auditory sensation in terms of which sounds can be ordered or on a scale ranging from quiet to loud. Timbre is a perceived sound quality of a musical note, sound, or tone. Timbre distinguishes different types of sound production and enable listeners to distinguish different instruments in the same category. The physical characters of sound that determine perception of timbre include the spectrum and envelope. In simple terms, timbre is what makes a particular sound be perceived differently from another sound, even when they have the same pitch and loudness. Tone is the use of pitch in language to distinguish lexical and grammatical meaning. That is, to distinguish or to inflect words. All verbal language uses pitch to express emotional and other paralinguistic information and to convey emphasis, contrast, and other such factors. It has been frequently observed that the tonal quality of the human voice changes while expressing various emotions. With different emotions and moods, not only does the tonal quality vary, but the associated speech patterns change too. For instance, people may tend to talk in loud voice when angry, and use a shrill or high-pitched voice when in a scared or panicked emotional state. Most vocal expression studies have used some variant of the standard content paradigm or the detecting emotional speech from real conversation. In the first method, an actor is instructed to read some verbal material aloud while simultaneously portraying particular emotion chosen by the investigator. The emotion portrayals are first recorded and then evaluated in listening experiments to see whether listeners can decode the intended emotions. The same verbal material is used in portrayals of different emotions and most typically has consisted of single words or short phrases. The assumption is that because the verbal material remains the same in the different portrayals, wherever factors appear in listeners' judgments should mainly result from the speaker's voice cues. On the other hand, in the emotional speech method from real conversation, the emotions are induced in the speaker using various methods and the use of speech synthesis to create emotional speech stimuli. Both methods have advantages and drawbacks. Despite the standard content paradigms ensure the control of the verbal material and the encoder's intentions, the doubt is about the validation between the posed and natural occurring expressions. Using real emotional speech ensures high ecological validity, but renders the control of verbal material and the encoder intention more difficult. Linguistic and non-linguistic information is coded simultaneously in human speech acoustic signal, communicated by the semi-acoustic voice cues. Furthermore, the voice contains other types of information about the speaker, as identity, age, sex, and body size. Human speech is produced by the speech articulator's continuous movement, such as tongue, lips, and larynx, that modulate the airflow so that speech sounds rich in the ears. According to the source filter model of speech production, the vocal acoustics is a combination of underlying energy source and filter effects due to resonance of the pharyngeal, oral, and nasal cavity up the suprapharyngeal vocal tract. While the source is mainly represented by the vibration of the vocal folds, the filter generates of the vocal tract's resonance are called formants, and the center frequencies are called formant frequencies. When the vocal fold vibration sets the air in the supraglottal vocal tract vibrating, the vocal tract resonance are acoustically excited, passing the frequency in the source waveform, that are near resonance and dampen outsource energy that is not near a resonance. In acoustic characteristics of vocal expression of emotion studies, the F0 voice intensity, distribution of the energy in the frequency spectrum, location of the formants, and the speech rate are frequently used to assess the emotion in voice. These aspects together constitute prosody. Peter and Cherry summarizing some research evidence selecting acoustic parameters related to specific emotions. To anger is characterized by an increasing mean of F0, F0 variability, range of F0, and the mean of energy. The fear is characterized by an increasing mean of F0, range, and high frequency energy. In sadness, is characterized by a decreasing mean of F0, range, downward director of F0 counters, and mean of energy. In joy, you can observe increases in mean of F0, F0 range, F0 variability, and the mean of energy. Several studies have shown that combination of acoustic parameters such as speech rate and the fundamental frequency could different emotions. The mean of fundamental frequency and speech rate are generally high for emotion associated with high sympathetic arousal like anger and fear, and happiness and anxiousness. However, one of the critical questions about a vocal detecting emotion lacks a theoretical approach, and the acoustic voice cues related to emotion-specific patterns to communicate discrete emotions. In summary, it's important to conduct a study about the expression of emotion from voice, the choice of what emotive states will be investigated, the quality of speech sample, and multi-parameter measure of voice, and physiological and phonatory-articulatory analysis. That's all. Thank you very much, and I'm open to questions. Acoustic voice cues related to emotion-specific patterns to communicate discrete emotions. In summary, it's important to conduct a study about the expression of the quality of speech sample, and multi-parameter measure of voice, and physiological.
Okay, thank you so much, Bruno, for the video. Now it's time for questions.
Professor Plinio, I don't know. For me, your voice, I couldn't hear a voice for the last 30 seconds. So if you could...
I'm sorry, because we are having instabilities here in Campinas because of the rain. Anyway, I was just opening the session for saying thank you to Bruna and opening the questions. The session. And we have a first question. Bruna is asking you what's the difference between feelings and emotions.
Okay, feelings is more about thoughts and cognitive aspects of the human, and emotions is more about the quick response to any event to individual.
Okay.
And second question is the Professor Patricia.
Professor Patricia is asking you about, can you tell something about twins' voices?
Okay. I never had anything about it, but we can expect that the same emotion expressed by twin siblings. We have similar values of acoustic parameters. I think that is a good question to a new research, Professor Patricia.
May I add something? I have a student that is defending his thesis on April on twins' voices. If someone is interested in the subject. Okay. Professor Patricia is asking you why the shimmer and jitter parameters are important to study human voice.
Okay. Jitter and shimmer show us some aspects of the voice quality. Okay, jitter more relates to frequency, and shimmer more related to intensity, variation in frequency. So it's a good parameters acoustics to analyze some difference in two individuals in the same context. And in case of twin symbols, it's possible to infer about some context of the living of the symbols. And I think so. Is this also?
It's okay, Patricia? Are you satisfied with the answer? Okay, before asking a question, I asked Alina's question. Why the list of emotions to study humans are too small? I mean that she's referring to basic emotions, I think. When it's clear that we can express a much bigger range of emotions.
Why the list of emotions to study humans are too small when it is clear that you can express a much bigger range of emotions? Really is we have more much emotions. We have several approaches to evaluate the emotions in human voice. How I cited the different theories to analyze it, but actually we have used a phrase, evaluation, and dimensional approach. I think I hope to answer your questions.
Okay, if not, I think Alina can ask again. The next question is for me. Because you work with animals, it's a speculative question maybe, but why the list, what kind of impact can have the study of animal emotions in our everyday lives?
Okay, naturalize the study of emotions will provide for more reliable data, okay, because emotions have evolved just as have other behavioral phenotypes. The Professor Eldo Brief provides us a dimensional approach of the emotion vocalization. It's a good, and we can evaluate some evolutionary aspects too.
Okay, the next question is, if someone went to measure the acoustic variables of the complex high-frequency calls of mammals, would it be reliable to measure automatically the acoustic? Or is it possible to rely on automatic measures only with simple calls?
If some measure wants to measure acoustic variables, I don't know answer this question. I'm sorry.
Okay. Someone, my colleague Patricia, is asking me a bit about twins' voices. In fact, my student Julio Cavalcante Oliveira is defending his thesis in April here at the University of Campinas, and he studied 10 pairs of twins from Alagoas, northeastern Brazil, and he is into some forensic phonetics. And it's important to check if it would be possible to discriminate twins' voices for forensic purposes. And then he found there are indeed we can verify or find different terms of rhythm in terms of F1, F2, and F3 frequencies in the acoustic space, even for twins living together the whole life. And because you know that the speech of someone depends not only on their nature, but also on the kinds of interaction they have. And of course, even for twins, the interactions are not exactly the same. They do different things. And it's possible to detect acoustic differences. And responding and answering the question about reliable measures, acoustic measures, yes, it's possible to have automatic scripts in Pratt, for instance, to extract different kinds of spectral, duration, and intensity measures completely automatically, either to simple calls or to complex calls. It's perfectly possible. We have another question for you, Bruna. Grief, for example, why isn't it on the list? I mean, she's referring to the list of emotions, I think.
I don't understand these questions.
I think the person is asking because in the list of 6 basic emotions, grief is not listed in these basic emotions. I think simply because it's not basic. That's the answer, I think. You know, I think, sorry for telling about this, but the most seen by this theory, dimensional theory, complex emotions like grief can be seen like a combination of basic emotions. And there's sadness in grief, for instance. It's part of grief, sadness, but there's some kind of other basic emotion that are also part of grief. That is not, how can I say, pure emotion. It's a combination of something else besides sadness.
Okay.
Sorry, I guess Professor Plino has problems.
I'm back.
I don't know, it's just for me or Professor Plino has some trouble in the connection?
The video of Professor Plino freezing.
Patricia, can you continue with the questions? I don't know. Or do we wait him?
No, I think he will come back quickly, but I don't think there are more questions. Let me see. I think Aline will like to talk to you, Bruna, for a long time about emotions and voices, because she was the one that asked most. She's really interested. She's always interested in that, so you can talk to it.
Okay, Aline.
Hi, Plínio.
I'm sorry for this interruption. Should I ask something else, or may I close the session? What do you think?
If you want to discuss something else, you can. If you have some questions that was not asked.
I was asking Bruna before the interruption that why, if she thinks that all the things she discovering in studying human emotions can be easily adapted to the study of animal emotions, for instance. There are some concepts in like basic emotion, like complex emotions. Do you think that can be adapted to the study of animal emotions? Like this example of grief. People say that elephants have grief, for instance. Do you think that this thing can be extended to easily to animal emotions, Bruna?
Exists several publications about it. Evaluate of emotion in animals, in non-human animals and mammals. I not read so much about it, but I believe that have some publication about complexity in emotions in animals. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Other questions? Okay, if I'm not hearing, I must listen.
Plinio, there is another question there from Ephraim.
To you, Patricia.
Can you hear me? No.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, there is another question. Is it here in the chat? No. It's from.
Yes. Yes. Now I can read it.
Okay.
Bruna, do you think there's a clear relation between human personalities and human voice acoustic measurements?
Okay, I'm repeat the question. Is there a clear relation between human personalities and human voice acoustic measuring? No, I believe that have not in literature about it, but is probably is the personality influenced directly the acoustic cues. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, thank you. Other questions? I have an additional question, maybe a final one. We think that you talk a lot. I know we are here talking about acoustics, but do you think that the study of facial expressions in animals, animals again, could be useful to a very nice contribute to the study of animal communication?
It's important to understand which emotion can provide a light about human evolution, cognition, and social learning. Take account the phrasal theory. Each emotion is caused by a group of phrases. We can observe this in animals too, which are evaluation and judgments of what event in the environment mean for all goals and well-being. Fear, for example, mobilize the body to fight or flee, and happiness rewards achieving goals and builds attachment to other animals, other individuals, people.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
I was in touch with Tina Bloom, and she sent me the photographs she made of dogs. She tries to trigger different emotions and to make a database similar of what Ekman did with the human faces. It's very interesting, I think. I can send you the article.
That's very nice. Very nice. Thank you. If you don't have any more questions from the chat or people here, I think you can approach the end. And I thank again Bruna Campos for the nice presentation, for answering all the questions, and people here also to allow me to talk about other things. Thank you so much. And thank you, Bruna.
So thank you all. Would like to thank Professor Plínio Barbosa and PhD student Bruna Campos de Paula. Remember, tomorrow we will start at 9:20 in another link. So now I'd like to call Professors Patrícia Monticelli and Emma Otta to talk a little bit about this first day of our conference.
Do you want to talk, to speak, Emma? I will speak, and then you can.
Only to thank the speakers and the moderators. It was a great day. We had the opportunity of hearing very interesting speeches, and invite everybody for tomorrow.
Yeah, that's what I want to say also, that they come back tomorrow. There will be another room of YouTube and Meet for the talkers and moderators. They come to the Meet when it's their time, and everybody, it's open on YouTube, and everybody can watch there. And that was great. We received some grateful. Now we are tired. The English will take more time to come, but lots of thanks very much for this day and for all the presentations. People like it. All the talks. They come with, oh, congratulations and very thank you and so on. So we are very happy and satisfied. And tomorrow we are back. Okay, so you can rest now.
See you tomorrow.
Obrigado, gente. Até amanhã.
Tchau, tchau.
Tchau.